Uh, Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this webcast this evening. My name is Amit Basole. I'm a faculty at Azim Premji University in Bangalore. Today, me and my colleagues, we would like to share some results with you. These are early findings of a phone survey that we have been doing to measure the extent of impact on livelihoods and on employment of the COVID-19 lockdown in different parts of India. What we have done here at Azim Premji University is partnered with several civil society organizations, which we will give you the details of later, to conduct these surveys in 12 different states, and we have a large sample of different kinds of workers. So we are able to say something about what is happening to self-employed workers, casual workers, and so on. Let me introduce my colleagues, and then I will pass it on to my colleague Rosa Abraham, who's going to start us off, and we are going to take you through the various findings that we have. If you have any questions, we request that you put them in the comments section, and one of us will be keeping track of that, and we will collect the questions towards the end and come back and answer them. We plan to go for around 40 minutes or so, followed by question and answers. So on with me today are Rahul Lahoti, who is a visiting professor at Azim Premji University, Rosa Abraham, who is with the Center for Sustainable Employment, also at the university, Surbhi Kesar, and Paritosh Nath, who are also at the Center for Sustainable Employment at the university. So may I request Rosa to take us off with the survey findings. Rosa, you are muted. You have to unmute yourself and start again.
Sorry about that. So, as Amit said, we wanted to understand the impact of the pandemic and the subsequent lockdown on households and their livelihoods. And so we started these phone surveys in the middle of April, soon after the announcement of the lockdown. As of the results that we are presenting, we have about 3,970 households surveyed. We intend to reach out to about 5,200 households. So the surveys are still ongoing. And the end of it, we would have about 5,200 households. And we essentially reached out to these households by collaborating with a number of civil society organizations across the country. And we accessed their networks to reach out to these respondents. So the collaborators that we have are Aga Khan Rural Support Program, the Center for Advocacy and Research, Gauri Media Trust in Karnataka, Paschim Bongo Khet Majur Samiti, Pradhan, Samalojana, Seva, Srijal, and Vagdara. So through these networks, we were essentially able to reach out to a wide variety of respondents across the country, including Karnataka, Rajasthan, Jharkhand, and several other states. We had reached across 12 states in the country. Almost 34 districts were covered where we had at least 30 respondents from that district. So this was broadly the range of the survey. And in terms of how we actually did the survey, as you can see, it was definitely not a random sample. This was a purposive sampling because we used our collaborators' networks. And in that sense, the sample really is not representative of the national level, but we have a wide spectrum of workers from the informal and unorganized sectors. It was a phone survey. Given the circumstances, this was the only way to go about doing the survey. And our survey, on an average, each survey took about 20 to 25 minutes to conduct. And in the survey, we broadly wanted to get at three broad heads. One was we wanted to understand what is the impact on the livelihood. So in the terms of the work and employment and the earnings that people were making. And for doing this, we essentially asked them what they were doing in the baseline, which is in the month of February. What was the kind of work you did? How much did you earn? And then we also asked about what had happened to their work, what had happened to their earnings during the lockdown. So this was one set of questions that we had. Then we also wanted to understand what were the implications at the household level, in particular their financial security, as well as overall precarity in terms of food intake. And finally, we wanted to understand the reach and the effectiveness of the various government relief measures. So these were the three broad heads under which the questionnaire was structured, and this is broadly what we asked about. So as I said, the surveys are still ongoing. We do intend to follow up with a number of these households in the coming months to understand how they have coped, how their employment is transitioned in the medium term as well. So who did we speak to? So of the 3,970 respondents that we had, about 60% of them were from rural areas. More than half of them, about 53%, were women. We also had about 8% of our sample being Muslims and about 80% Hindus. And a large majority of the sample earned less than 10,000 rupees per month. And what were the kind of work that our respondents were doing? So the activities that we have are broadly divided into three kinds of activities. And as you can see in the rural areas, this was predominantly self-employed workers. About 45% of our respondents were engaged in self-employed work. So self-employed work in the rural areas were largely in agriculture. So these are our farmers. In urban areas, the self-employed workers were petty shopkeepers, tailors, rag pickers, street vendors, and this was the broad profile of the kind of self-employed that we had. We also have a large share of casual workers. Casual workers included daily wage laborers, including construction workers and other workers who worked on daily wages. And finally, we had the salaried or regular salaried workers. These are essentially workers who receive a monthly salary or a stipend. And in urban and rural areas, these included domestic helps, security guards, housekeeping staff, garment factory workers, and so on. So through our networks and through our collaborators, we were able to reach these wide spectrum of workers. And now I will hand over to Surbi, who will talk to us about what really was the impact of these workers on their work and livelihoods as a result of the lockdown. And yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Rosa. So as Rosa mentioned, I'm going to just walk through some of the major findings that we have up till now in terms of the impact on livelihoods. Now, for livelihoods, we'll be focusing on two basic aspects. One is in terms of employment, where we'll be focusing on those who were working or those who were employed prior to the lockdown. What has happened to their work or their jobs during the lockdown? That's the first aspect. The second aspect is that of the earnings, where we are seeing that those who did retain their jobs during the lockdown, that is those who did not suffer loss in employment, what has been their impact on earnings? Now, in order to do that, we have two sets of questions in our questionnaire. So to every respondent, we ask them this employment and earnings question as to what they were doing and how much they were earning prior to the lockdown, which is in the month of February. And then we ask them questions of what is it that now they are doing during the lockdown and how much it is that they're earning. So we basically have these two sets of questions for all the respondents who were working, and that is how we're going to measure the impact. Next slide, please. So the results, as expected, are quite dismal and distressing. If you look at the third bar on the graph here, which is the overall loss in employment, this is telling us that 67% of those in our sample who were employed and working prior to the lockdown did not work during the lockdown. So the job loss was 67%. Now, this was particularly severe in the urban areas, where we find that 80% of those working lost employment or did not work during the lockdown. And this figure was, again, relatively lesser than urban areas, but still quite high. That is 57% of those working prior to the lockdown lost employment and did not have any work. So that is an extremely high number to talk about the job losses in the country during the lockdown period. Next slide, please. I will walk through it in terms of the activity status that Rosa just mentioned. We can see that particularly severely hit are the self-employed in the urban areas, where if you look at the second set of graphs, the first set of graphs is for the rural areas, the second set of graphs is for the urban area, where the first bar in each set represents the job losses among the self-employed, the second set talks about the job losses among regular salaried, and the third one talks about the job losses among the casual wage workers. Here we find that 84% of self-employed in urban areas lost their jobs during the lockdown. That is 84% of those who were working prior to the lockdown now lost their jobs, 84% of the self-employed. The figures are extremely high even for regular salaried and casual wage workers. As you can see, for example, 62% of regular salaried workers in rural areas and 76% in urban areas who were working lost their jobs during the lockdown. And but as one can clearly see that the effect is much more it's much higher in the urban areas than in the rural ones. Next, what can you please, yeah. So next, what I'm going to talk about is how is it, now here first we talked about how is it that the people are doing in terms of the jobs, and we saw that 67% of those who were employed prior to the lockdown lost employment or did not have any work post the lockdown, I mean during the lockdown. Now we're going to talk about what happens to the people who did retain their jobs, what is happening to their earnings. And here we're going to go by each activity status. First, I'll be talking about the casual wage workers. Now, this is the weekly earning of the casual wage workers pre-lockdown, the first bar. The second bar is their weekly casual wage workers earning during the lockdown, and finally the drop in the earnings. As you can see, prior to the lockdown, they were earning 938 rupees per week, and that drops to 482 rupees during the lockdown. This is for the casual wage workers who did retain their jobs. So it's almost a 50% drop in the earnings that happened. Next slide, please. If we're looking at self-employed, the drop is almost 91%. That is, they were earlier earning 2,385 rupees per week on an average prior to the lockdown. But what happens during the lockdown is that their earnings almost vanishes. It is 218 rupees, what they are earning now on a weekly basis. So the drop here is almost 91% in the earnings, which is the self-employed. Next slide, please. When we move on to the regular salaried workers, that is those workers which are receiving payment or salaries or stipends on a regular basis, we actually see that around 50% of them either were not paid or saw a reduction in their salaries. If you look at the bars on the screen, you can see the 47% is those whose salaries remain unchanged, and 35% are those for whom no salary was paid, and 16% saw a reduction in their salaries. Now, salaried or regular salaried employment is often considered in our economy as one of the less precarious forms of employment, which it is when compared to, let's say, the casual wage workers' employment or the self-employed workers that we're talking about. But even then, their conditions is not far from vulnerability, because this is as high we saw the drop in their salaries and earnings as well. Next slide, please. Now, finally, we talk about the farmers, which is the in our sample. When we were talking earlier about the self-employed, we are focusing mainly on the non-agricultural part of the sample. And here now we're talking about the farmers. And what we find here is that half of those farmers who had some produce to sell were not able to either harvest or not able to sell their produce because of the lockdown. And the major reasons given by these farmers for being unable to sell or harvest their produce was because there was no workers or machines available, but actually a much higher proportion of them said that they did not have the transport to go to the market. So even if they had the produce, they could not transport it to the market, because of which they were unable to harvest or sell their produce. Now, one thing that I would kind of want to emphasize is we've already talked about this massive drop in employment that's happened. We've already talked about the massive drop in earnings that's happening. One thing that remains central is that when we are talking about dealing with the crisis, it's not simply, it's also exposing the vulnerabilities that have always existed in the system. These are not simply new vulnerabilities. These were people, especially the informal workers who are in self-employed and casual wage workers, have always been at the precipice, and there is just falling through the cracks is what is now starting to happen. And that's what we are witnessing here. The lack of decent work, and the amount of vulnerabilities that exist for these large proportion of population in our country is what we are seeing getting reflected as the crisis has hit the economy. Thank you. Can I please request Rosa to talk about the impact on livelihoods?
Clearly, there's been an impact on earnings and people's employment and work. So it is only natural that this has then ripple effects on households. So we wanted to understand how households were coping with the crisis, and what we found were that 8 in 10 of those who were staying in rented accommodation reported that they would be unable to pay that month's rent, or they would have to borrow to pay that month's rent. And consequently, and not surprisingly, about 37% reported that they had to resort to loans in order to cover expenses that they incurred during the lockdown. And another important thing to note here was that this was particularly so in the case of urban areas, where a far higher proportion, actually about 42%, reported having to take loans in order to meet the expenses of the lockdown. So, when resorting to loans, another interesting finding was that most households are resorting to informal networks, which includes friends, families, and informal money lenders as the major source of loans. This is not surprising given the conditions of the lockdown, but we also see here again a huge reliance in the urban sector on these kind of informal networks for loans. The other implication for this kind of a huge economic crisis was obviously on food security of households. And we wanted to understand this. And what we found here was that when we asked households how much money they had to cover their essentials, we found that in rural areas, for instance, you can see the first two bars, about 37% reported that they had money to cover just about a week's worth of basic essentials. But the numbers are far more startling in urban areas, where about 66% said that they have money to cover just about a week's expenses. So here again, we see a far more, the crisis is far more exacerbated in urban areas for various reasons. Now, to understand how government relief measures have been able to, in a sense, reach these households, I'll hand over to Paritosh, who will take us through the reach and efficacy of these government relief measures. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosa. So the third aspect of this study that we wanted to look at, apart from impact on livelihoods and impact on households, was the set of relief measures and their reach and efficacy. So we basically tried to cover a number of things in this section of the survey, and we tried to look at what was the availability of food rations during the lockdown, what was the reach and impact of relief schemes that were announced by the government, the cash transfers that were supposed to be given out to intended beneficiaries. So amongst our respondents, did they actually receive it? And finally, the benefits accruing to vulnerable households. So in this survey, alongside a large sample of households, we also tried to look at the condition and the impact of relief measures on those households who are earning less than 10,000 rupees a month in the month of February. So we've termed them as vulnerable households to see what was the impact of relief measures on those households. So next slide, please. So coming to the public distribution system, and of all the things that we looked at in terms of relief measures, the one lifeline which came across was the PDS, where we find that in rural areas, 89% of our respondent households were able to procure ration from the government fair price shop. This though falls down to 69% when we come to the urban areas. And if you were to see that 15% of our sample respondents in the urban areas were unable to procure any food rations. Next slide. Yes. And on the question of rations, just one more point, that on an average, we found that people received between 5 to 7 kgs per person per household. So another scheme which was announced by the central government was the Jan Dhan cash transfers, wherein it was stated that for 3 months, a sum of rupees 500 will be transferred to females who are holding a Jan Dhan account. So then we tried to ask our respondents what was the impact of the same, and we found that around 64% of our entire sample does not have a Jan Dhan account. Of the sections which do, which was the rest of the 36%, around 80% in total. So 30% of our sample size received a Jandhan transfer. So whoever has a Jandhan account today did receive some cash transfer, but the problem is that the spread of the Jandhan is very low. And that is why we couldn't see that much of efficacy being brought on by the Jandhan scheme. Next slide. Thank you. So we also tried to look at other pensions, other cash transfer schemes that have been announced by both the central and the state governments. So as you know that there is a large list of state-specific schemes which have been announced, which go in tandem with the central government schemes under the Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana. And we found that in urban areas, only 17% of the respondents claimed that they had received any of those cash transfers. And when it comes to the pensions, which is under the NFSA, we find that only 36% of urban pensioners actually received their pension, whereas only 34% in the rural sample had received their pension scheme. Next slide. Yes, and now we try to then look at all the different cash transfer schemes, and we said that let us look at how many respondents or how many households which were in the vulnerable category, the category that I had mentioned earlier, which was earning less than 10,000 rupees in February, how many households received at least one cash transfer. And these numbers are really shocking because we see that 30%, 36% of vulnerable households admitted to having received at least one cash transfer. And this number goes up in the rural areas where 53% of rural households agree. But the urban story is quite alarming because these are the most vulnerable households and they are not receiving any sort of a cash assistance from either the central or the state government. Next slide, please. So this is the final thing that we also wanted to look at how many farmers actually got a benefit of the PM Kisan Yojana. So the PM Kisan Yojana transfers 6,000 rupees a year to the accounts of any landed farmer. And the government on the 26th of March announced that the first installment, that is the 2,000 rupees, would be transferred immediately, looking at the crisis brought on by the corona and the subsequent lockdown. But we found that only 1/4 of the 688 landed farmers that we spoke to had actually received transfers to the PM Kisan scheme. And this is supposed to be given out to the entire universe of farmers who have land. So this again is a very shocking thing that we observe. So all in all, broadly speaking, what we do find in the relief measures is that the PDS has managed to percolate down, especially in the rural areas, to provide food rations to the specific set of sample that we actually had studied or looked at. But in the urban areas, the situation is quite precarious across. And secondly, what we find is that cash transfers have been really limiting in terms of their ability to provide any form of a financial aid or benefit to the most vulnerable sections. Just one final point that I would like to mention over here, that as part of this exercise, we have also listed out the central and state level relief measures which one can access in the CSC website. And while doing the survey, we made a small SMS message that we sent across to all of our respondents in their various regional languages, informing them about the central or the state level schemes which were applicable to them, so that we hope that they can take avail of it or they can take benefit from it. Now I would like to ask Rahul to come in and talk about the presentation. Thank you, Rahul.
Next slide, please. Thanks, Paritosh. Let's pause a bit. So you heard a lot of numbers. They are shocking numbers. So let's take a minute to what is the survey about? It's not a representative survey, so we're not talking about India as a whole or any state, but this is a survey of informal vulnerable households across the country. So it gives you a good picture of what is happening. So what is happening? What is happening is we find that livelihoods are devastated. There is 8 in 10 respondents who have lost their jobs in urban areas. 6 in 10 in rural areas have lost their jobs. And they have lost employment in terms of either self-employed or casual workers or regular monthly salary, then whoever is working, whoever the small proportion, 33% of all people who are working, their earnings have vanished. For self-employed, it's almost 90% is gone. Now, this is huge. We haven't seen such a shock before, and it's difficult to just imagine how big a shock it would be in terms of everyday experiences of people. What has been happening? We also saw that people are more food insecure now because of this. People have to borrow a lot also from informal sources. They have worked through. They don't have enough savings for the next week or so. And lastly, what we found in the relief measures were grossly inadequate for the crisis. So just think about it: 500 rupees, which you get in a Jan Dhan cash transfer, is on average for a vulnerable household is between 2 to 5 days of their earnings, and they have lost 45 days of earnings because of the lockdown in several instances. So the cash transfers do not replace that. They are a pittance. And even this pittance, this 500 rupees, is very, only a small select 30% of people receive the Jan Dhan transfers. So what does it all mean? We have seen TV images about how migrants are suffering and dying every day. But the survey sort of points out that the distress is far beyond the migrant population. It's among the vulnerable and the poor populations. And so what does the survey help us? These findings are obvious. Everyone knew there is a lockdown, so nobody can work. So what's the use of all of this? The use is, we quantify the findings. You see the impact of the crisis. We know what is the impact, as well as how are people coping with it. And secondly, are the relief measures important, or are they working? So we have some suggestions based on the findings. Next slide, please. So what we find in the survey is that PDS is working. It's actually the scheme which reaches the majority of the vulnerable population. Between 85 to 90% of people have access to PDS. But what needs to be done is it needs to be universalized so that the other 14% of vulnerable households get it. What needs to be done is the government had promised pulses, but it hasn't worked at all places. That needs to be brought in, and it needs to be expanded for the next 6 months. The doubling of rations need to be expanded for the next 6 months. Second is, as I said, cash transfers. The 500 rupees per month is a pittance. So there have been demands by others, which we completely endorse, of doing and increasing the cash transfers to 7,000 per month. So one would imagine 7,000 per month per household is a huge amount, but it's not. If you take the average average size of an household, it's 50 rupees per person per day, which is not a lot. Then the other problem has been cash transfers haven't reached the people, because we have relied on Jan Dhan or PM Kisan to direct the transfers. What we need right now is we need to collate our information sources from NREGA, where people have NREGA cards, and because NREGA works through bank transfers, payments are made through them. We have information on those people which might not have Jan Dhan accounts. Similarly, Ujjwala, the PDS, and local registrations in urban places to expand the reach of cash transfers. We need to reach the 63% which Jan Dhan does not reach. Then, as we saw throughout the presentation, urban poor are severely impacted, and which is natural, which is because the lockdown have been more severe in urban places, as well as all self-employment. There's no activity in urban centers. So we need to focus programs for the urban poor and target them specifically. As the lockdown opens up slowly over the next month, NREGA sites should immediately open up as following the social distancing norms, and employment should be provided so that people can ultimately earn some livings, at least in rural areas. Next slides. So final thing is about how does the survey help us in terms of longer term policy making. As Surabhi mentioned earlier, there are these cracks which we knew in the society which existed, the vulnerability which existed. The crisis exposes them, widens them quite a bit. People do not have savings, and now if you take away employment, they are an employment over an extended period. They are quite devastated. So one is you expand NREGA. There have been suggestions for this for long in terms of there are various ways of expanding NREGA. One is that you increase the number of days to 150 days. You ensure wages are paid weekly for the next wages are paid weekly basis. Also that you bring other activities under the purview of NREGA in terms of preparing a mask and other activities, so that you expand the amount of employment that can be provided under NREGA. The other thing is introduce a national urban guarantee program, because MG NREGA can only reach, is directed towards rural. And so there should be a parallel program. There have been a detailed proposal of what this should look like was proposed by CSE last year. And following those guidelines to introduce an urban employment guarantee program, which focuses on improving urban infrastructure, improving the decaying ecological setup in urban places. Again, sort of working through helping in the crisis, both for sort of manufacturing of masks and other equipment, but also contact tracing, which should be a big thing, given that we cannot, because the survey clearly says we cannot afford blanket lockdowns. We have to go targeted. The last thing is the survey also exposes that the health system was already broken. And we knew about this, but now we see that there are shortages of healthcare workers, frontline workers who can go and talk to people, who can do the contact tracing. And so there should be a big push for universal basic services, both in healthcare and education. Next slide, please. So what, as Rosa and Amit said earlier, this survey, this is the first round. The survey is still ongoing, and we hope to get around 5,000 households, interview 5,000 households in the first round, and we'll follow it up after a month or so to regularly track what is happening, how the recovery process is going. We'll update the data regularly on a website, on the CSE website. There's a good dashboard which lets you explore things by rural, urban, and we'll add more features to it as we go. Next slide, please. So doing the survey has been a humongous exercise over the last month. That we have got excellent team of people who have worked overnight to handle various aspects. So this is the research team. Next slide. So here what we would do is the survey, the presentation sort of ends, but we'll be very happy to take questions. Amit will moderate the questions, and we can he might collate the questions and bring this up. Amit?
Thanks, Rahul. So what I will do is there's been a lot of excellent questions. Let me just first, before I get into the questions, I posted a comment which has a website address in it, which is where the dashboard and the details of the survey are available. You'll see a comment come up just over there. So please visit that site for more information, including the data. Now, let me first start by some questions are a common theme. So I'm just going to group and get some clarifications out of the way before we get into the more substantive questions. So a few questions commonly asked: is there a written version of this yet? Not yet, because this is we felt that it was important to get the early findings out immediately. So we have not yet written up the report, which we will be doing. But that may take a little while because we are going to bring in what other people have been doing, other surveys that have happened, and we would like to present a more holistic picture. So in a couple of weeks, we hope to be able to do it. We will keep you posted through our Twitter account and Facebook account, etc. That's the first thing. The second common question was about variations within states and by gender, etc. So there, again, today we presented only the very basic all India type of results because this is the first analysis round that we have done. We do have information by states. For some of the states, we have a decent enough sample that we can say something. So we will be producing that too. The data dashboard will have state level filters built in also in a few days. So you can come back to it and look at state findings. We did not have much from the mountain or the hill states. There were a few questions about hill states versus plain states. We have not done a survey there, so we don't know. The second was about gender. There were many questions about gender differences and so forth. Here again, we are able to say something because we've interviewed men and women workers, so we can distinguish impacts differentially by gender. However, there are some questions that came up like, were savings used more by women? Were household savings, like were more women's savings depleted, etc.? We don't have that level of resolution in the survey to address those questions. The other question that came up quite frequently was this question of employment versus jobs. So I want to qualify that when we are using the word jobs, it doesn't really mean a regular salaried job in every case. There are casual workers, self-employed workers, and regular salaried workers. So we are using it as shorthand for employment. So one question was, how can the self-employed lose jobs? What's happening is that they are losing earnings because of their businesses being shut down or maybe piecework not being given to them and so forth. So just wanted to clarify that. And lastly, one more clarification is on, there were a lot of questions on how do we understand these employment effects? Are they temporary, purely related to lockdown? Are they more long-term? And related to that, there's also a question about our own survey has taken so much time, so aren't the impacts varying week by week, so that later surveyed people might be affected more severely than earlier surveyed people and so forth. So I will just say, I will let others also address this question of time of survey, but I want to just say that whether this is a long-term situation or a medium-term situation, how soon will employment return? All of these are open questions right now. Nobody really knows. So we expect that our survey will address it a little bit because we are following people. We hope to follow them over a few weeks. But in general, I should say that it's a big unknown right now. What are going to be the persistent effects? Finally, just want to say that for the rest, there was one very important comment made when we were discussing PDS that we mentioned at the beginning that this is a purposive sample which we've reached through civil society organizations that are already working with people. So a lot of the general population might be much less aware of every scheme, including PDS, Jandan, or other pensions, etc. So you can take, in some sense, these results as, in a way, a better case scenario, because we were talking to people who are, to some extent, plugged in already through these organizations. For the general population, what is the level? We are not able to say because we didn't do a random survey of that kind. Right? That is also to be kept in mind while interpreting the results. So now I will take it over to my team. I would like, so there was one question about the intensity and how it varied, and because we interviewed people at different times. Maybe Rahul could take up that question.
Yeah, so we started the survey in mid-April, and we have the results right now. They're presented till May 9. Most of the data collection was in the month of May, from May 1st to May 9. But there were some organizations which had collected data earlier. We have not looked systematically across the timelines how it varies. But we do not expect an impact because lockdown situation was similar till May 3rd, and then there were some relaxations. But even after May 3rd, the relaxations were slow to lift.
Thanks, Rahul. There was another question about what is employment for us. I think one of the questions was about the exact definition of employment used. Are we following NSS type of things, or what are we doing? So maybe Rosa could say a little bit about how we did that.
Yeah, thanks, Amit. So when we talk about employment here, and especially in this situation, unemployment in itself is a very loaded term to use, which is why we've not actually used it. So when what we have talked about in people losing employment, what we are saying is of the people who had a job in February, how many of them were able to retain their jobs? So we see that a lot of people were, including self-employed, who basically don't have that as a means of their livelihood anymore at the time of the lockdown or during the lockdown. And so that's where we have this unemployment would be that they do not no longer have identify themselves as those kinds of workers, and they do not retain those jobs or those that employment status per se. And I just want to add also that when we talk about this, when we actually calculated these numbers, another nuance to it was that we found that there were a lot of women who were working in February. They were employed in some kind of paid activity. And when we asked them what they were doing during the lockdown, they said, "Well, I was attending to domestic household responsibilities." Now, typically, they would not be caught in our a standard definition of unemployment, but we also included this as a kind of a job loss or employment loss. And Surbi, if you want, you can add to this as well.
No, Rosa, thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Rosa. There were a lot of questions also about just kind of getting more information. Like somebody asked, did you do any qualitative studies to get a more kind of a richer description of what's happening to people, vulnerable households, and so on? So I just wanted to say that as a part of the project, we did have a component for doing a small amount of case studies for a certain, some small sample to get richer descriptions, but that will take some more time to happen. So we don't have much to show. At this point, we are only showing these kinds of numbers and some disaggregated. As I said, we'll be able to say something about, let's say, gender and state. But beyond that, we will not be able to say much, in a rich description kind of sense. Okay. Then there was questions about agriculture, which also I think the survey doesn't allow us to answer too much, but I'll let my colleagues come in on this. This is about what kind of shocks, what kind of income shocks have farmers experienced as a result of the blocks that we have identified. Let's say transport not being available or labor not being available. Do we have any estimate of the earnings lost? But we don't have exact way to say how much those earnings were.
If I may just add
go ahead.
to that. Yeah, for agriculture, because also a lot of times what might happen is that what they harvest in one period of the year, they can be using it or saving it in order to use for subsequent number of months as well. Therefore, to get a monthly earning for agriculture, therefore becomes a bit tricky. But what we have is in terms of the exact questions that we talked about, where almost half of them who did have produce to sell were not able to sell it. Mostly because they did not have transportation facilities available to them to take it to the market.
Thanks, Surbi. Rosa, were you going to say something?
No, I think there was a question on reaching out to female respondents, and I just wanted to address that we had the benefit because we were going through civil society organizations who already had some kind of a network with a lot of our respondents. We were able to reach out to a lot of female respondents, which is typically not the case for most phone surveys, where phone surveys often tend to miss out on female respondents. But we did not face that problem because of this great collaborations that we had. And we also, the other advantage in a sense of the phone survey, through these collaborations, we also had a very high response rate. So we had a response rate of 60%. So we didn't have to make too many calls to really get at a really viable and consented phone call. So we had an advantage because we had this huge, tremendous team of collaborators.
Thanks. There's a question about big towns versus small towns. Maybe Rahul, you could briefly address that.
Yeah. So just to so what Rosa had mentioned earlier had shown the slide with the different states and the sample sizes. What we broadly have is we had seven big metros which were covered: Delhi, Jaipur, Ajmer, Ahmedabad, Bhubaneswar, Bangalore, Pune, and rural areas in various places. And but we don't have a lot of sample from smaller towns, and that is partly because we were going the purposive route, and given the constraints with everything in terms of connectivity, reaching to people, we decided that this was the best method to reach out, because the aim broadly is not to be representative here, but to inform quickly what the vulnerable households are feeling, and this is a sample which we could reach out to.
Thanks. There's a question about state level efforts. Now, this is not part of the survey, particularly in the sense that the survey didn't cover details on state level schemes because there are many schemes that have been announced. But there is a question generally about which states have done more or less. So I wonder if Paritosh could say very briefly something about relief efforts in general and state level variations and so forth. Not necessarily connected to the survey as such, but generally if there's any.
Yeah, thank you, Amit. So yes, there has been a wide sort of difference noticed between different states and their performance when it comes to the survey relief measures. In fact, as I was making a point in the presentation, we have actually tried to track down the different state by level measures that have been announced, and certain states like Kerala definitely have had far more schemes and targeted schemes for specific workers. Another case in point is Odisha, which is actually trying to propose an urban employment scheme of sorts, which could try to mitigate the sort of crisis that has come over here because of the COVID lockdown. But we also do see that there are a lot of policies or a lot of state level measures announced on paper, but during our survey or analysis, and when we do the disaggregated analysis, by state, it would probably become much more clear that it's not really being translated on the ground. So that is something which we really need to look at. I would also request all of you, if you could actually go to the CSE website and check out the different state schemes, which would help us in understanding what are the different measures and what could be a larger policy direction which can be taken for us to overcome this crisis. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Very quickly, may I request Rosa to there are some people who came in late who are asking about sample size and states and such. So just a very brief overview of the total sample size and the states would be helpful.
Sure. So in terms of the final sample on which we presented today, we have about 3,970 respondents. So that's about 4,000. We broadly covered about 12 states, including Karnataka, Rajasthan, Jharkhand, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra. In Maharashtra, we only had Pune. But in general, overall, we had about 34 districts where we had at least 30 respondents from those districts. So that is the broad profile of the sample in terms of the coverage.
So yeah, thanks, Rosa. Rahul?
Yeah, so just to add to this, there were at least 100 blocks across the country which were covered. Because we were doing purposive sampling, but one of the intentions was that we go wide as possible. So the number of blocks covered, we targeted so that we cover more blocks. Additionally, a range of occupations were covered in the metros, all informal occupations. This was mentioned earlier, but rack pickers, domestic workers, street vendors, sort of petty vendors. You have casual workers, construction workers. So a range. There's a diversity in the survey coverage.
Thanks. There's some questions about PDS versus cash transfers and why one might be more effective than the other. And there's some related questions on Jan Dhan reaching, ability to withdraw from banks, etc. So again, our survey, is obviously limited how much you can ask in about 20-25 minutes, also at such a stressed period of time. So there were many questions that we might have wanted to ask but didn't end up asking. However, I want to see if the team has anything to offer on this issue of particularly on the PDS versus cash transfer issue that has come up.
So on the PDS versus cash transfer, given the level of distress, I don't think there is a either or. Which we are going for. The PDS sort of provides rations through the food network, and cash is essential for a bunch of other essentials. So in the crisis, we will need both. Effectiveness, currently the reach of PDS seems to be far bigger than of cash transfers.
Thank you. There are several questions on migrant workers, understandably, since of the crisis going on. Our sample did include migrant workers, but it was not a migrant workers focused survey. So I would like to see if there's anything that anyone from the team would like to share. These would be early impressions because we haven't, as I said, gotten into the details of many of the kinds of questions that we asked. We asked several questions and it needs more careful analysis than we have had the chance to do so far. We are releasing these early findings because it's a critical situation and we wanted to get it out in the conversation soon. But that said, any comments on migrant workers that anybody would like to make?
I can just add that, like Amit said, we did not ask questionnaire and our survey instrument was not really intended for migrant workers. We did reach out to a small sample of migrant workers, about 500 or so. And most of them were, interestingly, long-term migrant workers, that they had been in that state for more than a year. We did ask certain questions on whether they were returning home, and if they were returning, did they intend to come back. So most of the workers that we spoke to were either en route or they were returning. And on asked whether they would come back, at that point it was interesting that about half of them indicated that they would return to the place that they were working in. But this is still, again, very tentative findings, and the sample is also fairly small, so we wouldn't want to make too many broad conclusions on this at this point.
Thanks. There was also a small question on how we were defining farmers. So I should clarify that when we said farmers, we were talking about the landed farmers. And for the agricultural laborers, we have included them among the other casual workers.
Amit, there was actually a question on how have households diversified their livelihoods, and what is the sort of transition that we see. So just to respond to that quickly is that at this point, the only transition that we see is people are not working. They're not making any earnings, and they've lost their jobs. That's the most immediate transition. But what we do intend, as we mentioned earlier, is to have follow-up surveys with these respondents, and I think that would give us a better idea of how they've coped, whether they've diversified their livelihoods.
So there are some other questions on state level results, state-wise results, or sector-wise results. To reiterate, we haven't done the analysis, but on the dashboard, which will be active, and on the CAC website, as we do the analysis, things would be updated, and you can go and explore results by state. You can't do it today, but over the next week, you should be able to go and see the results for Karnataka. You can look at the sample, how the Karnataka sample is distributed, as well as activity status, and we'll keep adding as we move. And also, the sample size would increase from around 4,000 now to around 5,000 over time.
Thanks. There's a question on sale of assets, and this is a very important issue in terms of both household survival strategy as well as micro businesses. Because if there is a sale of assets happening, let's say, and many times micro businesses and household assets are not distinguished, so this can have long-term persistent effects if people have to do distressed sale of assets, land, other things, in productive terms as well as in consumption terms. Now, our survey asked about the borrowing habits and some savings, about how much savings were there to last without income, that kind of brief questions. But we did not ask detailed questions about asset ownership or sale. in this survey. Anything to add, anyone? Rahul.
Just to add, so asset sale also might not happen in the first month because obviously due to the lockdown it's difficult and people tend to do it a little later. So we intend to add some questions to look at how people cope in the second round of surveys, where we will look at assets.
So we'll wrap up in about 5 minutes. If there are, I'm sorry if we have missed any questions because there were many, so I tried to take as many as I could. But if you feel that you had a question earlier which was missed, could you please repost it so that we can deal with it in the last few remaining minutes? Yeah, Surbhi, you can go ahead with the...
Okay, so there were a bunch of questions in terms of the gendered impact of the lockdown. We are still exploring the results, and hopefully we should have that in our dashboard and in our report in a more detailed sort of way. But one thing that can be seen from the preliminary results is that the job loss has by a small proportion been higher for women than for men. But again, the caveat here is that since we are reaching out to all these people through the civil society organizations, some of the civil society organizations based in certain states will have a predominantly women or a predominantly male sample, which might then be affected by in which state that is happening. But in most of the states, we had a fairly balanced sample. And there we do find that the effect of job loss has by a slight amount been higher for women. If we talk about the drop in earnings, what's really happened, for example, I'll just talk about the self-employed earnings. The earnings have fallen for both men and women. So what's happening is for women, the earnings even prior to the lockdown were lower than that of the men. And now, since the fall has happened in percentage terms, the fall has been greater for men, and the kind of the difference between the two men and women have actually narrowed over time. But that is mainly because the earnings have fallen to such low levels. What we showed in terms of self-employed, it was around 200 something rupees of earnings, which is a minuscule level of earnings. So there's been a vanishing of both the things. So in terms of earning, the impact, especially for self-employed, is pretty much similar across the two. Thank you.
Thanks, Surbhi. A few quick questions to end with. One is just a quick one on the reason for taking religion into the survey. The reason is that there are well-known discrimination effects with regard to Muslims particularly, and also differences in employment types and so forth. So we wanted to see if it would be possible to say something about not only gender and caste, but also religion, if we had enough of a sample size in terms of differential effects by these social identities. Obviously, it's not a large enough survey that we can say everything. For women, I think we are in a much stronger position, but that was the reason for including religion in the survey. Just, I'm going to see if there's any last questions that we can take. So there are many questions about reverse migration and how those workers will be employed, strengthening the rural economy, increasing employment opportunities in the rural economy, to find employment for returning workers. And of course, we would, that is something that obviously should be looked at in the policy package going forward. But the survey per se doesn't have anything to say about that. This is something that in the report we could deal with. We did not ask about time use particularly. We were actually wanting to do that. There's been a lot of writing on how domestic responsibilities and so forth are being played out in this whole period. But in this survey, we did not do that. Neither did we have a lot of health related questions particularly, which is the other question that came up.
And just to add, sorry.
Go ahead, sir.
Just to add to this, the point is that we were asking these questions when these people have lost employment, are living on a day-to-day basis, where they are not able to access the basic necessities of life. We had to in some way prioritize the kind of things that we wanted to ask, because it's too much pressure on these people's time as well, and we're grateful to them for having actually shared these findings with us. But the entire idea of them consenting to the survey and giving us the time at this time was extremely problematic. And I think just because of that, we had to shorten the questionnaire as much as possible and look at the results that we thought might be, in our humble opinion, most important.
Thanks, Urbi. So we did not specifically ask about disabilities. That was one of the questions. And there's also a question about why, in terms of the PDS versus cash transfer, why are these lapses happening? And again, the survey can only go so far. We can't really understand these mechanisms through such an instrument. Caste is included as a category in the survey, yes, but we didn't present the results today. So any last comments from anybody?
So can I add a few things? Just one or two questions. One is, we asked about there's a question on for construction workers. Did we ask about the welfare board, the BOCW? We asked about that. We'll present the findings as we go. We haven't analyzed that yet. We also asked about whether people were able to withdraw the cash. There's a question related to that. And there were some grievances. We'll, again, as we go, present more evidence on that. So as we close, I would just like to close with a few things. One was that this was a humongous effort on our part. We are a small team and we haven't done phone surveys before. So there's a huge thanks to all the CSOs. We had around close to 200 or more enumerators from the various civil society organizations, which actually called people up, called them multiple times, and did the interviews for 15 to 20 minutes over this entire period. And it's completely impossible to imagine such an effort being done without them. So we just want to acknowledge that the civil society organizations, as well as people who actually did the survey. Obviously, as we mentioned, the respondents, because giving time in this and also talking about difficult things is problematic. But in addition, we would like to thank Manaswini. She's IIM Bangalore faculty, because she helped us a lot with the Bangalore part of the study. And I think that's about it from my side.
Thanks, Rahul. So let me end by saying, and connected to one question that has just come up about the possibility of an online discussion specifically on job creation in post-COVID kind of scenario, that we would like to, in fact, do a series of webinars using also the resources and the expertise of the CSOs that we have worked with, who have all gone out for many other work. I mean, this is just one thing that they did, but they're really out there collecting a lot of valuable information. So we'll be planning a series of these things where we will call the people that we've been working with also to share their experiences. And we will also do something specifically on themes, such as, for example, one could consider doing something on gender effects or something on specifically job creation ideas and so forth. So those are all, I think, very good suggestions for us going forward. There's also, the website also has a message possibility to message us. If you go to the CS, I put the link there. The main website also has a way of communicating to us. And here's the address that I'm putting in the chat window right now, which is the address of the Center for Sustainable Employment, where we are doing it as a part of this center. So please do email us any suggestions that you have about any of the aspects of this study that we have done today. And we thank you all very much for giving us the time and attending this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.